My husband left me to be with his ex, who had dumped him before, while I was giving birth to our first child. So, I let our son call another man dad. I met George at my workplace. We literally bumped into each other by accident. I was on my way to my office with a cup of coffee when I accidentally spilled it on both of us. I apologized quickly and tried to clean him up. But George, with a calm demeanor, told me not worry. I was instantly taken by his handsomeness and calmness. I could feel some of my female colleagues checking him out. 2 weeks later, we ran into each other again at the mall. I was there to buy some makeup and he was looking for a gift for his mother. I helped him pick out the gift, reminding him that it's the thought that counts more than the price of the gift. We later selected an ostrich hairpin for her and a black tote bag. After that day, we became friends. Whenever he visited my office to see my boss, he'd stop by to say hello. Over time, he opened up about his ex, Kate, who had left him to move overseas with her boyfriend after they'd made wedding plans. I could also relate. My boyfriend of 5 years had left me to marry a woman he once introduced to me as his cousin. We comforted each other over our past heartaches. As time went on, we grew closer. He would sometimes bring me roses, take me out for lunch, and invite me to dinners and movie nights. He was incredibly romantic and nice then. I was madly in love with him. He proposed, telling me he wanted to settle down and start a family. I also wanted a family of my own. Besides, I fell in love with him from the first we met at the office, so I happily agreed. We soon tied the knot in front of our friends and loved ones. To me, it was a dream come true. My friends at work also gushed about how lucky I was, and how they wish they will find a man like him too. I was so happy because I considered myself lucky. George had all the qualities a woman desires in a man. He is calm, handsome, smart, and successful. But things changed after we got married. A month after the wedding, I found out I was pregnant, and we were thrilled. At first, George was attentive, encouraging me to resign from work to focus on the pregnancy and child care. He even accompanied me to my first few prenatal visits. But as my belly grew, so did the distance between us. George started keeping late hours, often coming home drunk. We barely talked, and I felt increasingly alone in the marriage. My pregnancy was challenging. I was sick most of the time. I will throw up each time I ate. There was a time I passed out due to lack of strength after throwing up. But George wasn't there. Each time I called him, he had an excuse about how stressful work was. And I didn't want to burden him further, so I tried to be understanding. I attended most of my prenatal appointments alone because George was always busy. During one of those appointments, I ran into George's friend, Jackson. He also came for doctor's appointment. He asked why George wasn't with me, and I explained that he was tied up at work. Jackson waited for me at the hospital and offered me a ride home. He gave me his card in case I needed help. I thanked him, tucked the card away, and didn't think much more about it. As my due date approached, I noticed George becoming even more distant. Sometimes he would not come home until the next day. I tried to talk to him, but he began to blab about me not being considerate. He moaned about how he has been working so hard for the family, and all I do is sit at home and complain. Then one night, when I was about to sleep, my water broke unexpectedly. I was terrified and called George, but he didn't pick up. After several attempts, his phone went straight to voicemail. I was alone and desperate. I called my sister, Esther, to come with a taxi and pick me, since it's late and I couldn't drive in my condition. But as I waited for her to arrive, I remembered Jackson's card. I went to my purse, pulled the card, and called him, hoping he could reach George. To my surprise, Jackson arrived even before my sister. Seeing my condition, he quickly rushed me to the hospital, took care of the paperwork, and stayed with me through labor. He was by my side the whole time, doing everything that George should have been doing. The nurses even thought he was my husband. They kept talking about how reasonable he is. "Madam, your husband is a good man. Madam, you are so lucky your husband loves you." Due to labor pains, I was too weak to correct them. They even handed him the baby after he was born. He stayed with us throughout the night, and I was grateful I hadn't lost his contact information. My sister was furious with George the whole time, and promised to give him a piece of her mind. I tried to defend him, saying he was busy with work, but she didn't buy it. George finally showed up the next day, apologizing and using work as his excuse. But my sister didn't believe his story. Even Jackson was pissed with him, though he didn't say a word. My sister still went ahead to give him a piece of her mind. What could be more important than the life of your pregnant wife and child? My sister lashed at him. At that moment, I couldn't care less. I was also angry with him. Throughout last night, he didn't show up. He is now here after the labor is over, talking about being busy. But I was too weak to argue, so I ignored him and concentrated myself with feeding my newborn baby. Looking at his cute little face, I felt that the stress was worth it. George thanked Jackson for being there, and Jackson left to get some rest after a long, sleepless night. Throughout our stay at the hospital until the day we were discharged, George was with us. Occasionally, he would step out, claiming he had to work or meet a new client. Jackson also dropped by from time to time to check on me and the baby. I often found myself imagining what life might be like as Jackson's wife. His thoughtfulness and caring attitude drew me closer. Yet, I always shook off those thoughts, as I was already married to George. For the first 2 weeks, George acted like a good husband and father. But he soon returned to his "I'm busy with work" routine. Things only got worse when his mother moved in, supposedly to help with the baby. She would constantly nag about little things, call me lazy, and accuse me of spending her son's money. My workload increased with her presence. I now had to care for both the baby and my mother-in-law. She frequently disrupted my peace by inviting friends over, encroaching on the sanctity of my home. She would make me tend to her friends, cooking and serving them while they gossiped and played cards. I wanted to ask them to stop coming over, as their presence only added to my workload and the noise. But I remained silent, shackled by the weight of my unspoken thoughts. At the slightest mistake, my mother-in-law would scold me in front of her friends. I became so exhausted that I often wanted to leave the house to them. Whenever I complained to George, he'd tell me to bear with it, saying his mom would leave soon. I stayed patient. But she lived with us for up to a year, enjoying the comfort of a queen while I lived like a servant in my own home. George was unconcerned, and my only source of joy and comfort was my son, who kept me sane amidst the madness. Each time my sister visited, she would urge me to leave and file for divorce. She even suspected George of seeing another woman, although her suspicions weren't baseless. I kept making excuses for him, afraid of being a single mother with no job. I endured the situation until one night, when George came home drunk. That night, my mother-in-law berated me, claiming I was to blame for George's drinking. She talked about how impeccable his son was until he married me. I ignored her and helped George to our bedroom, removing his shoes and pants. As I tended to him, his phone beeped. A message from someone named My First Love appeared. I felt a headache as I realized it was the same woman who had once left him at the altar, using his drunken state. I unlocked his phone with his fingerprint. To my shock, there were countless messages between him and Kate. It became clear that during my pregnancy, George hadn't been meeting clients, nor was he busy with work. He was actually with her, the same woman that dumped him. Even the night I gave birth, he was with Kate, and his mother knew about it. The messages between them unveiled the painful truth. He had called me fat and ugly, even going so far as to promise Kate that he would divorce me to marry her. Who does that? Who insults their pregnant wife with such cruelty? Only someone truly heartless. I saw messages of Kate thanking him for the gift he'd bought her, gifts I had never once received. As I go through the messages and photos on his phone, I uncovered more betrayal. He had even spent a night with Kate at the hospital while I was at home, heavily pregnant and completely oblivious. The discovery sent hot tears streaming down my face, and I quickly took screenshots, forwarding them to my own phone. That night, I tossed and turned on the bed, unable to sleep. I felt so overwhelmed that it was hard to breathe properly. My mind raced, consumed by a single thought. What had I done to deserve such betrayal? While I struggled and sacrificed to bring our child into the world, George was off enjoying himself with his ex. I had resigned from my job and was called lazy, while he lavished attention on her. He even went with Kate to her doctor's appointments, yet didn't answer his phone when I went into labor. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I made a silent vow. I would make him and his mother pay for the pain they had caused me. The next day, George woke up, got ready, and came to the dining room for breakfast as usual. But this time, there was no breakfast. When he demanded to know why, I used his own excuse, saying, "I'm busy. I couldn't make breakfast." His mother started to scold me. "Are you crazy? Why wouldn't you make breakfast for your husband, since the only thing you are good at?" This time I didn't take her abuse lying low. I snapped back at her, warning her never to raise her voice at me again. If they wanted breakfast, they could make it themselves. George and his mother were shocked for a moment. I bet they didn't expect that a day like this will come when their free maid service will suddenly become unavailable. George became furious, cursing me for being ungrateful and disrespectful towards his mother. "I work so hard to put food on this table, yet I can't even get a decent meal. Is that too much to ask for?" Looks at George. I wondered how I managed to fall for such a despicable man. Sneering, I turned and walked away. Later that day, after George had left, I packed my belongings and those of my son, booked a cab, and prepared to leave. As I was about to go, Grace, my mother-in-law tried to stop me, insisting I leave my son, Jaden, with her. "Give me my grandson," she yelled. "If you want to leave, you leave. Besides, you are of no use to my son. At least he can marry someone that can support him. I won't leave my son for you. You and your son are despicable. You will both pay for all you did to me." I retorted and made to leave. She tried to block my way. I pushed her aside and she landed on the ground. I told her that I knew about George's infidelity and the part she played in it. She was shocked because she didn't know I already found out. While she was there whimpering and cursing, I left with my son and all our belongings. After I left, I filed for divorce on grounds of adultery and requested half of George's assets. I deserve more than that after all I had to endure. George and his mother were furious. They accused me of being a gold digger, but I didn't care. This is not some crappy romance novel where the female lead leaves empty-handed. I presented all the evidence to the court. The divorce went smoothly, as the evidence against him was undeniable. The court granted me custody of our son, and George could finally return to his trash. After the divorce, I moved back in with my parents. Being traditional, they didn't agree with my decision to leave my husband, but my sister defended me without hesitation. She told them, "If suffering the way Olivia did is your idea of marriage, then I'd rather stay single and join a convent." Eventually, my mom changed her mind when she learned everything I'd endured. She convinced my dad that divorcing George was the right thing to do, pointing out how tragic it would be if I stayed and ended up like those women who suffer in silence until it's too late. "It is better to have my daughter here with us than sending flowers to her grave," my mom said, letting my dad know will rather support me. My dad, though hesitant at first, eventually agreed. He cursed George for his foolishness and promised to support me in any way he could. With their support, I began rebuilding my life. I quickly started job hunting, eager to stand on my own and provide for my son. Once I secured a job, I used the alimony to purchase a new apartment. Though my mom wished I'd stay with them, I knew I needed my own space, so I promised to visit with Jaden every weekend. During the move, Jackson was there every step of the way. He and I had stayed in touch even before the divorce. Though our relationship had been purely platonic, he was a steady presence, always there to lend a hand or offer encouragement. One evening, he brought groceries over to my new place and insisted on cooking dinner. I doubted his skills but let him take charge. To my surprise, he prepared a delicious meal that Jaden and I savored. As we cleaned up afterward and put Jaden to bed, Jackson suggested we watch a movie. Midway through, a spark ignited between us, and he leaned in, kissing me. I was taken aback but found myself responding. Jackson held me and deepened the kiss. We kissed till we were out of breath. He then confessed he'd loved me for years, even before George and I had married. He explained that he had first noticed me in school, but family obligations had taken him away before he could approach me. Over time, he watched George take me for granted and struggled with his feelings. At first, I felt betrayed that Jackson knew about George's infidelities and hadn't told me, but I understood his reluctance to interfere in my marriage. He apologized, and I forgave him. Over the following weeks, our bond grew stronger, and Jackson began playing a fatherly role in Jaden's life. One evening, George was at a bar with his friend when one of them made a casual joke, calling him foolish for divorcing his wife to be with Kate, who was clearly playing him. "You can't force love. Kate and I love each other," George defended his affair. His friend laughed and said, "While you're chasing shadows, another man has taken over your family." George put down his glass and frowned. "What do you mean?" The people at the table looked at him as if he were silly. "Olivia is now with Jackson," someone said. Suddenly, George overturned the table in anger. "What did you say?" he shouted. Everyone at the table was shocked. None of them had ever seen him this angry before. "No one will take my family away from me." He then picked up a glass and smashed it on the floor before storming out of the bar in a rage. Meanwhile, I had just finished my daily activities and was about to tuck Jaden into bed. Jake was also at my house. We were now living as a couple. Most evenings after work, Jackson would come over to help with Jaden, sometimes staying the night. This was one of those nights. Suddenly, there was a loud bang at the door, as if someone was trying to break it down. I wanted to check who it was, but Jackson stopped me, saying he would handle it. As soon as Jackson opened the door, I heard a commotion outside, like someone had been punched. I quickly sent Jaden to his room and ran to the door, where I saw Jackson and George exchanging blows. I immediately called the estate security, because George looked like he was about to lose control and draw blood. He refused to back down, even as I shouted for them to stop. Jackson had no choice but to defend himself, matching George blow for blow. Soon, the security guards arrived and separated them. "What are you doing here at my house? And how do you know I live here?" I asked George angrily while checking the wound on Jackson's face. "You are my wife. How dare you cheat on me with him? Besides, I have wounds on my face too. Why are you checking him and not me?" George retorted. "You are delusional," I replied, looking at him with disgust. "You cheated on me with your ex, made my life hell, called me fat and ugly, and now you dare accuse me of cheating? Besides, we are divorced. I owe you no explanation." While we were arguing, Jaden came out and saw Jackson's bloody face. "Mom, did that bad man hit Dad?" he asked. Then he turned to George and said in his tiny voice, "Bad man? Why did you hit my dad? I'll call the cops on you." Wild-eyed, George looked at Jaden and me. "Why is he calling him Dad? I am his biological father." "Really? Then tell me, where were you when he took his first step? Where were you nights that he will be sick and we had stayed the night at the hospital?" He had been an absent father, pursuing his ex while neglecting our son. Even when we were together, he was rarely around and never played his role as Jaden's dad. Jackson, the CEO of an enlisted company, always made time for me and Jaden. He bought Jaden his first football, took him to the park, and read him bedtime stories, things George was too busy to do. I confronted George with all his mistakes, and his face paled instantly. He wanted to refute, but these were all facts. He broke down and begged me and Jaden to come back to him. In front of him, Jaden clung to Jackson, which seemed to crush George. He had neglected his role as a father for so long that Jaden didn't even see him that way. I reminded George of all the chances he'd wasted and made it clear that he was no longer welcome in my life. As we walked back inside, I told George, "You never know what you have until it's gone. Go back to Kate and don't come back here again." With that, I closed the door on the past and held tight to the future I was building with Jackson and Jaden.